Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little darker. Picture this. You're standing ankle deep in mud, rain beating down like it wants you dead. You've got a blunt sword in one hand, a splintered shield in the other, and you're surrounded by 100 other peasants just as terrified as you. They're shouting, screaming, the distant thrum of drums, and then a sudden zip through the air. Before you can even register it, the man beside you jerks violently and drops. An arrow's lodged deep in his face, the shaft still vibrating. He doesn't scream. He just collapses into the muck. Welcome to the 100 Years' War. You weren't trained for this. You were just told to show up. Maybe a local lord came through your village and dragged off the able-bodied. Maybe you volunteered for the meager coin they promised. Or maybe you just got unlucky and happened to be the youngest son of a family with nothing left to eat. Either way, congratulations, you're now a soldier. But here is the real kicker. You don't even know why you re-fighting. Most of the peasants and lower knights caught in this bloodbath had no idea who started it, what it was about, or when it might end. All you know is someone called the English is invading again, and you be supposed to die in a field somewhere to stop them. Or maybe you are the English, and you've been told France is yours by right. Doesn't matter. You're still soaked, starving, and terrified. And if you think you might survive by being clever or keeping your head down, think again. Even veterans got cut down in seconds. Armor didn't guarantee protection. Shields splintered. Arrows ignored rank. The longbow alone made entire formations of armored men obsolete. No matter how noble your birth, one well-aimed arrow and you were just another body on the pile. The man who fell beside you, he didn't scream because he couldn't. He died before he hit the ground. His blood mixes with yours in the muddy soil, and already another volley of arrows is in the air. You raise your shield and pray. Not to God, because by now you're pretty sure he's got better things to do, but to the idea that maybe, just maybe, this time, the arrow will hit someone else. And yet this moment, this brutal clash, is just a single blink in a war that would drag on for more than a century. 100 years of back-and-forth bloodshed, shifting borders, betrayals, famines, and fires. And this was just the beginning. Because to understand how it got this bad, how two royal families turned half of Europe into a killing field, we've got to rewind to when the war should have ended. But didn't. So here's the twisted part. The 100 Years' War wasn't even supposed to be the 100 Years' War. It didn't start with a bang. It started with a slow legal tantrum over who got to sit on a chair. In 1328, the King of France died without a direct male heir. That's when Edward III of England piped up and said, "Hey, I'm his grandson through my mom. I should get the throne." The French nobles didn't love that idea, because if a king could inherit the French crown through his mother, it meant all kinds of dynastic chaos could erupt. So they said, "No thanks, Ed," and handed the crown to a cousin instead, Philip VI. Now Edward could have let it go. He didn't. Instead, he stewed. And in 1337, he declared himself the rightful King of France. That's how it started. Not with an invasion, not with a massacre, but with a royal tantrum. And what followed wasn't a war like we think of today. It was more like a storm system that never moved off the coast. Decade after decade, it just lingered, rained misery, then died down, then flared up again, always ready to destroy another generation. There were actually long stretches where nobody was officially fighting. Treaties were signed, truces declared. But that didn't mean peace. It meant armies were still roaming the countryside, looting, foraging, and occasionally massacring villages just for fun. Even in peacetime, the war was always hanging over you like a rusted sword held up by a fraying rope. This is why the 100 Years' War is so infamously hard to explain. It wasn't one long, continuous battle. It was more like a seasonal illness. It flared up, got bloody, burned everything down, then went dormant. And just when you thought it was gone, it coughed and killed another 100,000 people. And the people who suffered the most? Always the ones who had no say in any of it. You didn't get a vote in whether the king claimed France. You didn't even get to know where France was half the time. All you knew was one day, soldiers rode in and told you to fight, or pay, or die. But what made it even worse was that this wasn't some neat, orderly chess game between countries. Because neither England nor France existed in the way we think of them now. They were patchworks, confusing, overlapping webs of titles, loyalties, and grudges. So when someone says, the English invaded France, what they really mean is, a guy from Gascony led troops from Normandy under orders from a duke who owed money to a cousin of the English king. It was a mess. And that mess would go on to reshape Europe, wreck thousands of towns, and swallow generation after generation into the meat grinder. Kids would be born, grow up, and die under the same war without ever seeing peace. That's not a war. That's a curse. And to make sense of just how confusing it was, we got to break down the weirdest part, the fact that neither side was really one side at all. France wasn't France. England wasn't England. If you were dropped into medieval France during the 100 Years' War and asked, whose side are you on? The answer would probably be, whose side am I allowed to be on without getting stabbed today? That's because the idea of France and England as neat, unified nations just didn't exist yet. There were kings, sure, but most of the land belonged to nobles who ruled like little kings themselves. These guys had their own armies, their own taxes, their own grudges, and sometimes they switched sides. One year, your local lord might be loyal to the King of France. The next, he's flying an English banner, demanding you swear fealty to Edward. A month after that, he's dead, his sons flipped again, and now you are a traitor because you stayed put. People weren't patriotic, they were practical. Survival meant bending with the wind and keeping your mouth shut. If English troops showed up at your door, you fed them, let them sleep in your barn, and prayed they didn't torture fields. When the French returned, same deal, because the moment you picked a side, you put a target on your back. And it wasn't just peasants caught in the shuffle. Even the kings were tangled in this web. Edward III of England technically held land in France as a vassal to the French crown. Yes, you heard that right. The King of England was also a subject of the French king. That's like being your rival's boss and employee at the same time. So the lines were blurry, dangerously blurry. You couldn't tell if the knight riding through your village was friend or foe until he started swinging. Even accents didn't help much. Many English nobles still spoke French. Many French soldiers came from regions that had once been part of England. Loyalties were local, not national. The real horror of it was that the war wasn't just two sides clashing. It was everyone constantly shifting, lying, or betraying each other to stay alive. You could be fighting for one king, get captured, switch sides to save your life, then be forced to attack your own village. That wasn't unusual. That was normal. Imagine living your entire life under that pressure, never knowing who you could trust, never knowing if the flag hanging in your village square today would still be there tomorrow. Your own neighbor could be an informant. Your priest could be sheltering enemy scouts. Your cousin could be conscripted by the English and ordered to burn down your town. And then there's the towns themselves. Some switched hands 5, 6, even 10 times over the course of the war. Imagine being a blacksmith in a town like Calais. First, the French control it. Then the English siege it for nearly a year. Food runs out. Disease spreads. People start dying in the streets. When the English finally take it over, they don't just kick out the leaders. they evict everyone. An entire population gone, replaced with loyal subjects from across the channel. New language, new rulers, new taxes. And you're lucky if they don't torch your workshop on the way in. You couldn't afford to be proud. You could only afford to survive. And sometimes, even that was too expensive. But while commoners were busy trying not to get trampled by both sides, their own kings were making life even worse by bleeding them dry from the inside. Here's the cruel irony of the 100 Years' War. You could avoid the battlefield, dodge the arrows, escape the fires, and still get wrecked by your own king. Because while the English and French armies were busy battering each other in open fields, their governments were busy draining every last coin from the people back home. And when we say draining, we don't mean politely asking for a contribution. We mean brutal, relentless taxation that made simply being alive a financial liability. In France, it started with a tail a direct land tax on the peasantry. But as the war dragged on, the monarchy added more. Gabelle, a tax on salt. Aids, sales taxes, and customs duties on pretty much anything that moved. And they didn't just tax stuff. They taxed entire ways of life. If you brewed ale, sold cloth, raised pigs, harvested wheat, pressed wine, dug clay, or even baked bread, there was a tax attached to it. If a lord couldn't squeeze enough from his lands, he might hire thugs called tax farmers to beat it out of the villagers. And guess what? Those guys got a cut of whatever they collected, so they had every reason to be enthusiastic. Couldn't pay? Say goodbye to your ox, your tools, or your children's grain for winter. In England, things weren't better. They were different in a worse way. Instead of just squeezing the poor, Parliament started taxing the whole country. One infamous example, the poll tax. Everyone over a certain age had to pay the same amount, regardless of income. So a nobleman with 300 acres and a vault full of silver paid the same as a crippled beggar in rags. Unsurprisingly, this didn't go down well. The English government used this money to fund campaigns in France, meaning English peasants were being taxed to pay for wars they didn't start, fought in countries they'd never see. It was like being billed for a crime someone else committed. And this wasn't occasional. It was constant. When the fighting paused, the taxes didn't. In fact, in some cases, taxes increased during ceasefires because the kings still needed money to bribe allies, repair castles, or raise new armies, just in case things flared up again. But here's the worst part. Often, that money didn't even make it to the front lines. Corruption was everywhere. A noble might collect funds to hire 100 archers, then only show up with 60 and pocket the difference. Entire wagons of supplies would vanish on their way to the battlefield. Officials skinned off the top, middle, and bottom. And you? You still had to pay, again and again. Eventually, this broke people. In England, it led directly to the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, when villagers finally snapped and marched on London. Their battle cry wasn't just about taxes, it was about dignity. About not being treated like walking coin purses with straw. Hats. The rebellion was crushed, of course, but the fear it struck into the hearts of the elite lingered for years. Over in France, it was even grimmer. Because the French king didn't just tax, you had to feed his army too. When French troops passed through a village, they expected free food, free lodging, and free labor. Couldn't provide it? They helped themselves. And if you resisted, they burned the place down as an example. So whether you lived in a thatched cottage in Kent or a stone hut in Picardy, the message was the same. This war will take from you, even if you never see it. And just when you think it couldn't get worse, when your purse is empty, your fields are barren, and your morale is shot along comes a man on a black horse. A prince, not here to help. He's here to burn everything. They called him the Black Prince. Not because he wore black, though, he did, but because his name left a stain wherever he went. Edward of Woodstock, son of Edward III, was the golden boy of English royalty. A knight's knight. A warrior, so skilled, so charismatic, so devastatingly brutal, he became the nightmare of the French countryside. And when he showed up, he didn't come quietly. The Black Prince didn't believe in sieges or slow battles. He believed in something called a chevauchée, a scorched earth raid, where you ride through enemy territory and destroy everything. Not just soldiers. Villages, crops, livestock, mills, granaries, vineyards, orchards, nothing was spared. The point wasn't to conquer. It was to starve your enemy into submission. Picture this. You're a farmer in southern France. It's late summer. You finally brought in a decent wheat harvest after 3 years of famine. Your family might actually make it through winter. Then you hear hooves. 1,000 of them. Edward's army pours over the horizon. They don't knock. They don't negotiate. They set your fields ablaze, slaughter your animals, and cut down your fruit trees for firewood. If they're feeling polite, they let you flee. If not, they leave you with broken bones, or worse. In one raid, they burned 500 towns in a matter of weeks. And it worked, not just militarily, but psychologically. Even the French nobles who hated each other more than the English were forced to unite in fear. Because the Black Prince wasn't just stealing food, he was unmaking the land. His goal was to make it uninhabitable for his enemies. And for you, that meant your home, your work, and your life were now tools in someone else's war. Worse still, he wasn't an exception. He was the blueprint. After Edward, scorched earth tactics became standard. If a town resisted, it burned. If it submitted, it got looted anyway. Soon, it wasn't just the English doing it. French commanders learned from him. They returned the favor-burning English-allied towns, poisoning wells, destroying bridges. You were just a pawn caught between torches and the idea that your king or lord would protect you. Laughable. Lords fled before the raiders came. Castles slammed their gates shut, leaving villagers outside to be slaughtered. And if your own army did show up, you were just as likely to be conscripted, fined, or forced to give up your last donkey. For the cause. But Edward didn't stop with raids. In 1356, he led one of the most humiliating campaigns in French history, the Battle of Poitiers. There, his much smaller force crushed a massive French army, capturing King John II of France himself. Yes, captured. A king. Taken prisoner. And while the French monarchy scrambled to figure out how to pay the astronomical ransom, guess who got to cover the bill? That's right. You. The French people were taxed harder than ever. Not just for the war, but now to buy back their king. Meanwhile, nobles threw lavish banquets and jostled for power. Commoners were starving. Again, Edward returned to England a hero, paraded like a god of war. But across the channel, villages still smoldered. Families sifted through ash where their homes used to be. And the legacy of those chevauchés would linger for generations. People spoke of him like a ghost. Don't anger the English, or the Black Prince will return, they'd whisper. But the violence he unleashed didn't just break the countryside. It broke the system itself, leading to uprisings, chaos, and something even more terrifying. The day when the peasants finally said, enough. Imagine your boss gets kidnapped by the competition. That's essentially what happened in 1356 at the Battle of Poitiers. Except instead of awkward press releases and ransom emails, it was full-on swords, mud, and screaming horse, and the boss wasn't just any noble. He was King John II of France. The French had assembled a massive army to stop the Black Prince, who was once again tearing through the countryside like a human wildfire. They figured this time they'd end it. Outnumber him, surround him, beat him at last. That's not how it went. Edward, outnumbered almost 2-1, lured the French into unfavorable terrain where their heavy cavalry got stuck in mud and confusion. The English longbowmen cut them down like stalks of corn. It was a total disaster. And then, somehow, amidst the chaos, the French king himself was captured, physically dragged off the field. King John was treated with honor by his captors better than most English villagers, honestly. They took him back to England and housed him in luxury while they negotiated a ransom. And when I say ransom, I don't mean a few chests of gold. The English demanded a fortune. So much money, it made the French economy spiral into crisis. To raise the cash, French officials squeezed the peasants harder than ever before. New taxes were passed. Old taxes were doubled. Whole communities that had already been burned and pillaged now had to pay for the honor of getting their king back. People couldn't afford bread, let alone tribute. And remember, none of them had voted for him. Most had never even seen him. But they were still expected to hand over their last chicken to bring him home. And just to twist the knife a bit deeper, guess what King John did after he was returned? He voluntarily went back into captivity. No joke. His son, who was supposed to be the temporary hostage, while France scraped together the rest of the ransom, escaped. So John, in some bizarre show of royal honor, sailed back to England and surrendered himself again. The French people weren't sure whether to applaud or scream. Their king had left them twice, once on the battlefield and again by choice. By then, France wasn't just humiliated, it was fractured. The nobility fought each other for scraps of power. The government was in disarray. Entire regions operated like mini-kingdoms. In the vacuum, bandits and rogue mercenaries formed roaming war bands, pillaging whatever was left. Even towns untouched by Edward's rampages were now suffering under the chaos of their own government. And this is the moment when ordinary people truly snapped. They'd watched their taxes vanish, their towns burn, their king get dragged off like a misbehaving child. They were hungry, angry, and out of options. So they did the one thing left. They rose up. Because when you've got nothing left to lose, not your money, not your home, not your safety sometimes, the only thing left is rebellion. And what happened next would make even hardened knights flinch. It started in the spring of 1358, just outside of Paris. A rumor, a whisper, a rising tide of anger that finally boiled over. The peasants, exhausted, starved, and pushed past the point of desperation, rose up. And what followed was one of the most brutal uprisings in medieval European history. The Jacquerie. Now, let's be clear, this wasn't some organized political revolution. There were no manifestos, no leaders in shining armor. Just mobs of farmers, millers, blacksmiths, and shepherds armed with pitchforks, axes, and pure rage. Rage at being taxed to death. Rage at watching their homes be torched by armies they never asked for. Rage at a ruling class that seemed to care more about ransom money and silk cloaks than the starving people beneath them. The trigger? The French king had been captured. The nobles were bickering like spoiled children. And the countryside had become a playground for mercenaries and thieves. Villagers were being robbed by bandits at night and taxed into oblivion by day. The people cracked. And the nobles? They weren't ready. The Jacquerie was fast, explosive. Dozens of castles were attacked in days. Nobles were dragged from there. Keeps and killed on the spot. Wives and children, too. The rebels didn't discriminate. They weren't looking for mercy. They were dishing out what they thought justice looked like. They burned manor houses, ripped ledgers and tax records to shreds, took weapons from armories. Some even dressed in looted noble clothing and paraded through the streets. mocking their former masters. It was part protest, part apocalypse, but the nobles regrouped. And when they struck back, they did it with the kind of cruelty that medieval Europe had perfected over centuries. Led by Charles the Bad of Navarre, that was his actual nickname. The nobility crushed the rebellion in a matter of weeks. Whole villages were wiped out. Rebels were tortured, drawn, quartered, and displayed as a warning. And those who weren't killed were fined, yes, fined for daring to revolt. Their homes burned, their families shattered, and now they owed more in taxes. And the worst part? Nothing changed. The war continued. The taxes stayed. The mercenaries kept pillaging. The nobles kept squabbling. But something deep in the French psyche had been scarred. A line had been crossed. And for the rest of the 100 Years' War, that memory of the peasants rising and being put down like dogs in the air. And if you thought that was as bad as it could get, think again. Because just as the blood from the Jacquerie was drying, the sky darkened and an invisible killer began sweeping across Europe. And this one didn't care what side you were on. You'd think war was enough. You'd think burned fields, shattered villages, and watching your king get hauled away like livestock would be the low point. Nope, the 100 Years. War had a crueler trick up its sleeve. Because just when the people of France and England thought things couldn't get worse, when their backs were broken and their stomachs were hollow, the Black Death arrived. It rolled into Europe like a silent wave in 1347, creeping in through ports and trade routes. By 1348, it had exploded. By 1350, whole towns were empty. In some places, half the population was gone. Gone, like they'd never existed. Parents buried children. Children buried parents. Sometimes, there weren't even enough people left to dig the graves. Imagine it. You're already dodging tax collectors, raiding parties, and angry lords. Then one day, your neighbor develops a fever. He starts coughing, swelling. Black blotches bloom across his skin. Within days, he's dead. So are his wife, his children, and the man who tried to carry his body away. The plague didn't care if you were French or English. It didn't care if you were a soldier, a priest, a beggar, or a baron. It came for everyone. But it hit villagers the hardest. Why? Because you were already weak, malnourished, living in damp huts with rats and fleas. Those same fleas carried the plague. And while you begged God for mercy, the church bells rang endlessly, for funerals, for warnings, for silence. Many believed it was the end of the world. And honestly, it felt like it. There were no doctors, no treatments, no explanations that made sense. Some blamed the stars, some blamed sin, some blamed foreigners, leading to massacres of Jews and travelers in desperate, violent attempts to stop the spread. And just when you think the reaper's gone, just when you think your village has survived, the army shows up. You see, war didn't stop for plague. In fact, it got worse. With entire towns dead or dying, armies marched through like vultures. Mercenaries, out of work and out of food, formed free companies roving bands of killers for hire who looted. What was left? They weren't loyal to any flag. They fought for gold, for bread, for sport. And with law and order shattered, nobody stopped them. The worst part? They were often better armed than official soldiers. Knights without masters. Archers without kings. They'd ride into a village, promise protection for a price. If you paid, they bled you dry. If you didn't, they lit the thatch and moved on. Even nobles hid from them. And so, in the 1350s and 60s, parts of France looked less like a nation, and more like a haunted ruin. Roads became death traps. Farmland reverted to weeds. Entire provinces were abandoned. Wolves returned to the outskirts of cities. Monasteries stood empty, bells silent. No grain, no bread, no hope. All while kings plotted more campaigns. Because even as the dead piled up, Edward III wasn't finished. He launched another push into northern France. Cities like Reims, Chartres, and Paris became targets. And though the Black Death had delayed his plans, it hadn't ended them. If anything, the devastation made conquest easier. Fewer defenders, weaker resistance, more empty homes to occupy. But even the English started to feel it. Back home, fields lay fallow. Taxes went unpaid. Entire units were thinned out by plague. And still, the war dragged on. Because once it starts, a machine like this doesn't stop. Not until it eats everything. And if the plague seemed like the darkest hour, wait until you see what happened when those roaming armies stopped pretending to be soldiers and started acting like predators. There's no horn blast, no trumpets, no declaration, just hoofbeats. By the time you hear them, it's too late. The war has arrived, not in some distant field between kings, but in your backyard. And it doesn't look like a grand battle between heroes. It looks like fire, hunger, and men in armor stealing your last goat. See, the front lines weren't just some defined strip of land with soldiers on either side. During the 100 Years' War, the battlefield was everywhere. If you lived in rural France or even parts of England, you never knew when soldiers would arrive. And when they did, it didn't matter who they claimed to fight for. They came to take. First, they'd seize your livestock, then your grain. If you had a cellar, they'd rip it open. If you had a daughter, you'd hide her. If you had nothing left to offer, they might burn your home out of boredom or spite. And this wasn't rare. It was normal. The armies, especially the unpaid or underpaid ones, were essentially roaming gangs with flags. Once they passed through, you'd be lucky if the well still had water and your barn still had a roof. Entire villages were left as skeletons, blackened, stone, ash-covered fields. The lucky ones fled in advance. The unlucky ones never got the chance. And God help you if you lived along a trade road, because trade routes weren't just for merchants. They were the arteries of invasion. Every major push English into Normandy, French into Gascony, rode along these roads, which meant your little village on the edge of nowhere suddenly became strategic, not for glory, but for plunder. Mercenaries were the worst. The so-called free companies didn't follow laws or chivalry. Their loyalty was for hire. If they weren't paid, they turned on the countryside. They'd move in like a storm, loot everything that wasn't nailed down, then disappear over the next hill onto the next victim. Some towns tried to defend themselves, makeshift militias, wooden walls, but they rarely stood a chance. And when they lost, retribution was vicious. Public executions, mass burnings, piles of bodies left in the square as a warning. The church tried to offer sanctuary, but even monasteries weren't safe. Raiders looted chapels, melted down sacred relics, even attacked monks. Sometimes, priests paid bribes to keep their flocks alive. Other times, they fled first. And if you tried to escape to the cities, good luck. Many walled towns refused to open their gates to refugees. Too risky, too many mouths to feed. So you slept outside the walls, in the cold, in the rain, with your children huddled against your chest, listening to distant screams echo through the countryside. Even the seasons betrayed you. Winter meant starvation. Summer meant raids. Spring brought tax collectors. Autumn brought soldiers passing through for supplies. Every month was a new threat. And every year, fewer people returned to the fields. Some died. Some vanished. Some simply gave up and became part of the very war they once feared. That's how peasants became soldiers. not by choice, but by survival. And when the armies ran low on men, they came recruiting, not from the cities, from the villages, from you. And the next thing you know, you're not hiding from the war anymore. You are the war. So you're standing in your village square. Your hands are calloused from years of working soil that barely feeds you. Your boots are patched with scraps of leather and hope. And now a man in armor is barking at you to pick up a weapon and fight for your king and country. You try to explain that you're not a soldier, that you've never held a sword, that your wife is sick and your son is hungry. But none of that matters. You're breathing and you're strong enough to carry a spear. That's all they need. Welcome to the draft. 100 Years' War didn't just chew through nobles and knights. It burned through manpower like fire through a wheat field. And when the professional soldiers ran dry, they turned to the peasants. You didn't get training. You got a stick with a pointy end, and maybe a helmet if you were lucky. And then they marched you off. You walked for days, maybe weeks. Mud caked your boots, rain soaked your clothes. You slept in dishes, ate moldy bread, and listened to the veterans joke about how many men they'd seen gutted before breakfast. When the fighting came, it wasn't gallant. It was chaos. Screaming, clashing steel, smoke that burned your lungs. Men running from the field, bleeding and blind. You jabbed your spear at whatever moved and prayed it wasn't someone from your village. You weren't there because you believed in the cause. You were there because you had no choice. Some were promised coin. Others were told their families would be protected in their absence. But everyone knew what that meant. More taxes, more raids, more loss. And still they marched. The English especially relied on this. In battles like Crécy and Agincourt, the backbone of their army wasn't shining knights. It was long bowmen, ordinary men who trained in archery since childhood because the law required it. The idea was simple. A commoner with a bow could take down a knight on horseback from 200 yards away. Efficient, cheap, deadly. French nobles hated this. To them, it wasn't honorable. War was supposed to be about valor, not volume. But arrows didn't care about honor. They punctured lungs and tore through plate armor just the same. So the battlefield began to shift. Gone were the elegant charges of mounted lords. Now it was about mud, discipline, and projectiles. And guess who had to slog through the worst of it? You. If you died, you weren't buried with honors. You were dumped in a mass grave. If you lived, you went home missing fingers, coughing blood, or dragging a limp leg behind you. The lucky ones got out early. The unlucky ones got drafted again. A year later. And what did you fight for? A king you'd never seen. A piece of land you'd never visit. A cause you couldn't explain if someone held a blade to your throat. But the horror didn't end when the trumpet stopped. Sometimes the battle wasn't the worst part. Sometimes it was what came after. Because one day you'd fight in a field called Agincourt, and the mud, the arrows, and the bodies would rewrite everything you thought war could be. October 25th, 1415. It had rained all night. The field outside the tiny French village of Agincourt had turned into a swamp of sticky, sucking mud. That's where you stood shoulder to shoulder with 1,000 other tired, sick, and underfed Englishmen, your bow in hand, your boots sinking with every step. You weren't a knight. You weren't even a soldier by trade. You were a longbowman, one of thousands. And today, you were about to face a French army that outnumbered you at least 3-1. The French had knights, plate armor, heavy cavalry. They believed it would be a slaughter, your slaughter. But the mud had other ideas. As the French charged across the field, their horses bogged down almost instantly. The weight of their armor turned every step into agony. And then the arrows came. Thousands of them. From behind wooden stakes pounded into the earth, you and your fellow archers unleashed a storm. Arrow after arrow, volley after volley, the sky went black. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't chivalrous. It was mechanical, relentless death. The knights fell, not in glory, but in heaps, piled on top of each other in a writhing, groaning mass, suffocating in their own steel. Horses thrashed and screamed. Men slipped and drowned in the blood-mixed muck. And still, the arrows rained down. You didn't stop. You didn't blink. You drew, loosed, and drew again until your fingers bled. By the end of the battle, over 6,000 French were dead. The English? Maybe a few hundred. It was one of the most lopsided victories in medieval history. But there was no celebration. Not. Really. Henry V ordered the execution of hundreds of French prisoners, many of them high-born nobles. It shocked the world. But he feared another French charge. And besides, there weren't enough men to guard them. So they were cut down, on their knees, in the mud. Some begged for mercy. Others cursed. Most just died. And you? You watched. Maybe you helped. Maybe you turned your head. Agincourt was a turning point, not just in the war, but in the nature of warfare itself. It showed that armor wasn't invincible, that common men with bows could take down the elite, that terrain and tactics mattered more than bloodlines and banners. But it didn't end the war. It prolonged it. The French were humiliated, but not defeated. The English were emboldened, but overstretched. And the commoners? They bled, as always. When you finally limped back home, if you made it at all, your reward was a small bag of coin, a broken body, and stories no one wanted to hear. And as you tried to sleep that first night, your ears still rang with the memory of arrows slicing through the rain. And your mind, whether you liked it or not, had one question pounding inside it. What happens when you're the one being shot? At next time? Because sooner or later, the war always comes back around. What no king ever admitted, and no chronicler ever fully captured, was just how brutal the 100 Years' War was between the battles. Because while the history books like to talk about Agincourt, Poitiers, and Crécy, the reality for most people wasn't glorious charges or famous speeches. It was the stuff too ugly to put in poems. Picture this. You're a farmer in a quiet hamlet, far from any major fortress. You've survived the raids. You've survived the taxes. You've even buried loved ones lost to plague. But one afternoon, a group of riders appears on the horizon. They're not wearing any clear colors. No banner. Just hardened men in chainmail and leather, laughing like it's all a game. You don't run. You can't. Where would you go? Within minutes, they've taken your food, your animals, your tools. Then they turn on your family. Your wife is dragged into the barn. Your daughter hides under the floorboards. You want to fight. You try. But a boot in your face and a sword to your throat make it clear you're not in charge anymore. And then they leave. Just like that. They ride off to the next village, laughing, chewing stolen bread, tossing coins they didn't earn. Maybe they're soldiers. Maybe they're deserters. Maybe they're mercenaries no longer paid. Doesn't matter. The damage is the same. And the people who did it? They're often the same ones who were supposed to protect you. See, discipline in medieval armies was loose at best. Most commanders turned a blind eye to looting, especially if supplies were short. And rape? Often ignored entirely. It was an unspoken part of conquest, a perk of the job, as grotesque as that sounds. It happened in France. It happened in England. It happened in every field, village, and roadside inn that got caught between hunger and a blade. In cities, walls offered some protection, But even that wasn't guaranteed. During sieges, desperate defenders sometimes sold out their neighbors to avoid complete destruction. Women and children were traded like livestock in the hopes of mercy. And when the walls fell, the soldiers poured in. There were no rules. Not really. And even when justice was attempted, it rarely served the victims. Lords might execute a looter if it was politically useful, but if he was a knight, if he had connections, a slap on the wrist, maybe exile, usually nothing. And so, people stopped expecting justice. They started hiding what little they had. They buried food in the forest, disguised daughters as boys, learned how to listen for hooves before they ever appeared. Every generation grew up with new tricks for surviving the ones who claimed to be their own army. By the 1400s, entire regions of France were considered lawless. Not because there were no laws, but because no one enforced them. Roads were ambush zones. Fields were abandoned. And the men who once fought for kings now fought only for themselves. And this cycle, it wasn't just tolerated, it was fed. Because as long as kings needed armies, and as long as those armies needed to eat, someone had to pay. And if they couldn't buy their survival, they bled for it. But amid all this darkness, a glimmer of something strange began to form. A teenage girl, poor, illiterate, claimed to hear voices. And somehow, she would become the symbol of hope for a dying nation. Before, being betrayed and burned by the very people she tried to save. She said she heard saints, angels, that she'd been chosen by God to save France. If you were a peasant in 1429, you wouldn't roll your eyes. You'd listen. Because for decades, kings, knights, and nobles had failed you. They'd taxed you, abandoned you, and bled your village dry. But now here was this girl barely a teenager claiming she could end the war. And somehow, impossibly, people believed her. Joan of Arc was no one. A farmer's daughter from Domremy. No formal education. Couldn't read. Couldn't write. But she rode into history like a storm. Claimed she'd been sent by heaven to drive the English out and crown Charles VII as King of France. And within a year, she was leading armies, winning battles, rallying broken soldiers, inspiring villagers who'd long since lost hope. She dressed in armor, rode a war horse, marched into fire without flinching. At Orleans, she helped turn the tide. That city was under siege, the walls closing in. Then she arrived, riding with a banner instead of a sword, and within days, the siege was broken. The French started winning again. People called her the Maid of Heaven. Others said she was a witch. And for the first time in decades, the peasants dared to believe things might get better. But hope is dangerous, especially when it comes from someone outside the power structure. Especially when it comes from a peasant girl claiming to hear the voice of God. The nobles tolerated her when she helped. But the moment she became inconvenient, when her victories threatened to upstage their authority, they looked for a way to get rid of her. She was captured in 1430, not by the English, but by French allies of the English, the Burgundians, sold to her enemies, betrayed by her own side. And what did the church do? Put her on trial for heresy, for wearing men's clothing, for claiming divine visions. The trial was a farce. They denied her a defense, twisted her words, tried to break her spirit, but she never gave in. Not fully, until they lit the pyre. She was tied to a stake in Rouen, barefoot, alone, barely 19 years old. The crowd gathered. Some cheered, others wept. A bishop gave the signal, and Joan of Arc was burned alive. They made sure it was slow, made sure there'd be nothing left to bury, because they feared even her bones might become relics. She didn't scream for mercy, only for Jesus. And after it was over, the world kept spinning. Charles VII whom she had helped crown, said nothing. He owed his throne to her, and he let her burn. But Joan didn't vanish. Her name stayed in people's mouths. The English tried to erase her. The French hesitated to claim her, but the peasants, they remembered. Her story spread, not as a martyr, as a reminder that even in the darkest times, someone had dared to fight back. Decades later, she was retried, this time posthumously, declared innocent. Too little, too late. And as the war dragged on and the blood kept flowing, the question that haunted everyone on both sides was simple. If they could destroy her, what chance did anyone have? If you were hoping the English, side had it together. If you thought maybe they were the adults in the room, while France flailed in chaos guess again. Because the war may have started with bold kings and brilliant commanders, but by the 5th-10th century, England's crown was cracking. And then came Henry VI, a boy king, who would grow into a man utterly swallowed by the pressure. A man who went mad while his kingdom slowly unraveled beneath him. It started when he was just 9 months old. That's when he became king, not of one kingdom too, England and France. At least on paper. See, after Henry V's victories, including the Treaty of Troyes, which disinherited the French Dauphin, and made Henry's son heir to the French crown, it looked like the English had won. But paper isn't reality. Henry VI never knew peace. He grew up with advisors, regents, and nobles running the show. And when he finally came of age, he was soft, kind even, bookish, religious, and utterly unsuited for ruling two angry, war-torn kingdoms. He wasn't a king. He was a passenger, dragged behind the cart as it careened off the road. At first, it was just indecision. Then came paranoia, then catatonic spells. He'd go silent for days, stare off into nothing, forget who people were. He once couldn't recognize his own newborn son. England needed a leader. What they got was a ghost with a crown. Meanwhile, France, after decades of loss and humiliation, was regaining strength. Charles VII, finally energized after Joan of Arc's victories, began reclaiming territory piece by piece. The French reorganized their military, cut down corruption, built a standing army, and England? It fractured. With Henry mentally absent, nobles filled the power vacuum. They schemed, they bribed, they raised private armies. Factions formed York versus Lancaster. Ambitions grew. By the time anyone looked up, the 100 Years' War was fading into the background because civil war was brewing. This is the madness spiral. While English peasants still paid taxes to support an unwinnable war, their leaders were too busy stabbing each other in the back. Some English commanders abandoned French territories because they needed troops at home, not to fight the French, but to fight their fellow Englishmen. And in the middle of it all was Henry VI, a man who prayed for peace while his subjects drowned in blood. By 1453, the war's symbolic end, England had lost nearly all its holdings in France except Calais. The dream of an Anglo-French empire was dead. The soldiers returned home scarred, bitter, and unemployed. The fields back in England were full of restless men with weapons and no direction. What do you think happened next? They turned on each other. Within 2 years, England plunged into the Wars of the Roses, a brutal series of dynastic civil wars that made the 100 Years' War look almost civilized. So if you were alive in England in the mid-1400s, you weren't celebrating victory or mourning defeat. You were just bracing for the next army to march through your village, whether it wore red roses or white. The war may have started with a question of inheritance, but by the end, it had infected the very idea of kingship itself. And even as the dust settled over France and England licked its wounds, the people living in the ashes had no sense of peace. Because something strange happened after the war ended. The violence didn't stop. It got worse. In 1453, after more than a century of fighting, treaties were signed. Territories were redrawn. Nobles shook hands. The 100 Years' War was over officially. But if you were a peasant in France or England, no bells rang in your village. No parades came down the street. Because for the people who had actually lived through it, nothing really changed. The war had hollowed out the land. It had burned the forests, salted the fields, and left towns in permanent ruin. Even the victorious French didn't feel like they'd won. Sure, they reclaimed most of their territory, but what was left of? It? Scattered farms, broken bridges, missing fathers. The nobility strutted through court again, but the common people limped through another year of famine. And for the English, it was worse. The dream of empire was gone. The myth of English. Superiority shattered. Thousands of veterans poured home wounded, traumatized, and angry. They didn't get pensions. They didn't get land. Most didn't get anything but a cold shoulder and a ruined economy. What came next wasn't peace. It was a vacuum. The power structure in both countries had shifted, but not settled. France had a stronger monarchy, sure, but half the countryside still smoldered with resentment. England, on the other hand, was about to cannibalize itself in the Wars of the Roses, a brutal family feud that made old enemies look like best friends. And the soldiers? They didn't just disappear. Mercenaries who'd once fought under banners now took jobs with whoever paid. Or they didn't bother with a job at all, they just took food, coin, lives. Many joined Roudier's freelance death squads that drifted across France, shaking down towns like medieval mafia. Meanwhile, the people tried to rebuild. But how do? You rebuild when your entire life has been scorched? Whole generations had grown up knowing nothing but war. Kids had seen their first corpse before their first harvest. Young men had learned to wield a blade before they ever kissed someone. Women had learned to expect loss over and over again. Even the calendar felt broken. The years blurred together. You stopped counting by seasons and started counting by sieges. That was the year the English burned the vineyards. That was the winter after they took the castle. That was the spring we buried our last ox. And yet the kings moved on. Charles VII reigned in peace. Henry VI crumbled. New wars rose. New battles came. But for the people who had lived through the 100 Years' War, peace wasn't a treaty. It was an illusion, because nothing had been resolved. The system that caused the war dynastic greed, feudal exploitation, hunger for land and power was still alive, still humming beneath the surface. It just needed time, a few years to regroup. And when it did, the cycle would start again. Because while the 100 Years' War was over on paper, its shadows were still walking through the villages. It's 1460. The banners are gone. The last sieges are memories. But you're still standing in the same ruined village, staring at the same cracked well, asking the same question. What now? Because war may be over for kings and courtiers, but not for you. Your war hasn't ended. Not when your neighbors are dead. Not when your barn is cinders. Not when your fields are barren and your body still aches from the last time soldiers dragged you through the mud on suspicion of hiding grain. The war may be gone, but the pain stayed. Everywhere you look, there are reminders. The burned foundation of the chapel, the stone shell of the mill, the cratered roads, the grave markers, if there are even enough stones left to carve names. And the people? What people? Half the population of some regions never came back. Some fled, some died. Some just disappeared. Whole villages were reduced to 5 or 6 families trying to farm land that used to feed 50. No trade, no doctors, no real law, just silence and rot. You don't just recover from 100 years of war. There's no blueprint for how to. Rebuild a life where 3 generations were raised on bloodshed and betrayal. The war lasted so long, it replaced normal life. It became the new normal. Even your body tells the story. Maybe you lost a toe to frostbite during a campaign. Maybe. Your leg still limps from where a spear grazed it. Maybe your hearing never returned after that cannon blast. You're a walking ledger of every trauma the war could throw at you. And now you're supposed to farm? To marry? To smile? You barely remember how. And here's the twist. You're still being taxed. Yes. Even now, even after the war, the crown wants coin. Because rebuilding takes money, and the nobles aren't volunteering their jewels. So they come to you again, with their ledgers and their threats. If you can't pay, they'll take your tools. Your last sheep, maybe your son. And you want to scream? For what? For the new castle? For the Lord's feast? For the same system that threw your father into a ditch and called it glory? But you don't scream. You bow your head. Because deep down, you know, peace is a word. Survival is a job. And the trauma doesn't just live in your bones. It lives in your children. You see it in the way they flinch at distant thunder. In the way they stare at men in armor with eyes too old for their faces. In the way they've never played in the fields like you once did. The war is over. But it isn't gone. It's stitched into every scar, every debt, every dream you no longer dare to have. And just beyond the hills, another problem stirs. Because the soldiers who walked away from the battlefield, they didn't walk far. The war had given them purpose, food, camaraderie, weapons. For some, even pride. But when the 100 Years' War ended, tens of thousands of armed men were cut loose into a broken countryside with no jobs, no homes, and no direction. What do you think happens next? They kept doing the one thing they knew how to do: fight. But now they fought for themselves. France called them accoucheurs, skinners. They traveled in gangs, dozens or hundreds strong, bleeding the land of whatever scraps it had left. Some still wore their old colors, patches of torn English red or faded French blue, but the only flag they really followed was hunger. You could see them coming from miles away mounted, armed, and grinning. If you were lucky, they demanded coin and rode on. If not, they ransacked your village, took your livestock, and left a few corpses for the crows. And it wasn't just France. England had its own bands of former soldiers, many of whom had returned to find their farms taken, their families gone, and their promises from the crown unfulfilled. They knew how to kill. That was it. So they did. Sometimes they posed as mercenaries, offered protection for a price. Sometimes they claimed to be on royal business. But deep down, they were just raiders in chainmail, acting out the war long after the kings had declared it over. And you? You didn't stand a chance. The guards at your town's gate? Too few. The local lord? Probably hiding behind the walls of his manor. You either handed over what little you had, or braced for violence. It was a simple choice with terrible consequences either way. Entire regions gave up trying to resist. Towns paid bribes in advance, leaving coins on stone markers outside the gates. Others dug trenches, built walls, or simply vanished, abandoning everything to flee into the woods. And in some twisted way, the bandits were organized. They had leaders, nicknames, even rudimentary uniforms. Some were former captains who had fought at Agincourt or Poitiers. Men who once stood in line on royal battlefields now led raids on grain carts and church treasuries. The church called them heretics. The nobles called them criminals. But they weren't punished. Not often. Sometimes they were hired again, brought back into royal armies during new skirmishes, civil wars, or overseas ventures. Killing was a skill, and skilled men were hard to come by. So the nightmare lingered, because while the official war was over, 100 smaller wars had bloomed in its place. Personal grudges, land feuds, mercenary turf battles, and each one left more smoke, more blood, and more broken lives. You might survive the army, you might survive the plague, but you wouldn't survive them, these shattered men, drifting like wolves, clawing at what was left of a bleeding continent. And as they roamed, one town remained as a relic of the old war, stubbornly clinging to English hands. Calais. And what happened there says everything about how this war refused to die. For over 2 centuries, Calais was England's foothold on the continent, a gateway, a badge of pride. And after everything else had been lost Normandy, Gascony, Aquitaine Calais stood like the last tile on a crumbling game board. The English called it the brightest jewel in the English crown. But if you lived there after the 100 Years' War, it didn't feel like a jewel. It felt like a prison. The city was technically English soil, but surrounded on all sides by France, isolated, fortified, heavily taxed, and always paranoid. For every crate of goods that passed through its port, there was a sword nearby to make sure nobody got any. Ideas. Calais was valuable for trade and wool exports, but also dangerous, a constant reminder to the French that England wasn't quite gone yet. The people? Mostly English. Or at least English-speaking. After Edward III took the city in 1347, he expelled nearly every French resident and repopulated it with loyal settlers. By the time the main war ended, Calais was an island of England surrounded by bitter enemies. And every man, woman, and child inside those walls lived in fear of one thing. The day France came back for it, soldiers were stationed year-round. Merchants lived under strict curfews. The city was ringed with walls, towers, and sea gates. Every ship that entered was searched, every cart inspected. You were more likely to see a spear than a smile. And yet, it endured. Even as England collapsed into civil war, even as France rebuilt its shattered countryside, Calais remained, propped up by English pride and sheer stubbornness. It became a symbol of defiance, of memory, of a war that refused to let go. But it also became a dead end, for English soldiers being assigned. To Calais was a kind of exile. For traders, it was an expensive gamble. For peasants, it was a trap. You couldn't farm the surrounding land. It was hostile territory. You couldn't leave easily, too many checkpoints. You just stayed and waited and watched the sea for signs of what would come next. And what came next wasn't glory. It was 1558. Long after the 100 Years' War had ended, the French finally stormed the city. They took it in days. Calais was too weak, too tired, too alone. England, caught in other struggles, couldn't save it. Queen Mary wept when she heard the news, claiming that when she died, they would find Calais engraved on her heart. But for the people inside, there were no grand laments. There was looting, displacement, execution. The war may have ended in 1453, but this was the ghost still lingering in its wake. A symbol clung to for too long, finally ripped away. And yet, Calais was just one part of the ruin. Because, while walls could be rebuilt and cities retaken, the real wreckage, the silent suffering, was still happening in the one place. History forgot to look. Inside the homes of the people who stayed behind. They didn't wear armor. They didn't carry swords. But women bore the weight of the 100 Years' War in ways the battlefield never recorded. You wouldn't find them in war chronicles, not often. Yet their suffering was constant, personal, and relentless. And long after the last arrow flew, their wounds kept bleeding in silence. Imagine this. Your husband was conscripted 10 years ago. You haven't seen him since. He's either dead or worse alive, and serving another lord. You have no proof. Of death, no income, and 3 children asking when dinner is coming. You're not just a widow, you're forgotten. An invisible casualty. And if he did come back, it wasn't the man you remembered. Maybe he came home limping, with one eye, or with nightmares that made him scream in the night and lash out in the day. No help, no healing, just a broken man in a broken home. And the burden falls on you. Women became the glue of every crumbling village. They worked the fields, raised the children, repaired what could be fixed, and buried what couldn't. All while living under the constant threat of violence from roving bands of soldiers who didn't always need a reason to take what they wanted. Rape was so common, it wasn't even called rape. It was called part of war. A woman's body wasn't her own. It was a prize, a message, a spoil. And there was no one to protect her, not the church, not the law, not her lords. In some places, women learned to flee at the first sign of hooves. Others stayed, prayed, and endured. And if she became pregnant, too bad. There were no hospitals, no midwives in wartime. Many women gave birth alone, in stables or burnt-out homes. Infant mortality soared. So did maternal death. And even when the baby lived, that child bore a name that marked them for life. Bastard. A label that closed doors before they could ever knock. Some women turned to prostitution, if not by choice, then by necessity. Towns near garrisons often became shadow cities of brothels and camp followers. These women lived precariously used, discarded, sometimes executed when the soldiers got bored or needed to show discipline. Others disguised themselves as men to survive. They took up weapons, fought in small skirmishes. Some joined bandit gangs. A few became legends, though most were buried without names. And all the while, they held families together. They kept the fires lit, tended gardens in trampled fields, whispered bedtime stories to children while listening to wolves and war drums. In the distance, but no statue was raised for them. No songs written, no scrolls penned. They were expected to endure. And they did? But the cost? It etched itself into every wrinkle, every hollow stare, every hand rubbed raw from digging graves and kneading bread. And when they died, another woman took their place. Because the war didn't need permission to ruin you. It only needed time. And it had plenty of that. But for the children born in those years, the ones who never knew anything but hunger, fear, and dust, their future wasn't much brighter. They were born into smoke, into silence, into the long shadows of missing fathers and shattered homes. The children of 100 Years' War weren't raised, they survived. And in their eyes, you could see what a century of bloodshed does to a soul before it even learns to speak. Imagine growing up in a village with no men under 40. Your playmates aren't other children. They're your mother's grief, your grandmother's stories of the before times, and the muffled sobs behind closed doors. You learn early how to scavenge, how to lie low, how to tell which soldiers might kill you and which ones might just take your bread. You don't ask about your father. No one answers anyway. Maybe you're an orphan. Your parents lost to plague, or fire, or the sword. Then you get passed around, if you're lucky. If not, you're left to beg, or worse. Some orphans joined the same bands of soldiers that ruined their towns. Others were taken in by monasteries or lords with enough guilt to feed an extra mouth. Many didn't make it past winter. And if you were born during the war to a mother no one would name, you were labeled a bastard. And that wasn't just a word. It was a sentence. Bastards couldn't inherit land, couldn't marry freely, couldn't enter the church. You were a second-class citizen before you even understood the rules. And in a world obsessed with bloodlines and honor, being born on the wrong side of legitimacy was like wearing a target you couldn't take off. The war had stripped away entire family trees. It didn't just kill, it disrupted lineage. Land went unclaimed, titles were forgotten, names lost. Whole houses disappeared. In the chaos, many children grew up rootless, with no history, no inheritance, and no expectations beyond the next meal. Some of them turned to the sword. Why not? That's what the world had taught them. Violence gets attention. So they joined mercenary bands, became foot soldiers, cannon fodder. Young boys barely strong enough to lift a pike, pushed into formation and told to die for a lord they'd never see. Others turned to theft, or smuggling, or nothing. Just wandering from ruin to ruin, sleeping in the ruins of burned-out abbeys and whispering bedtime stories they barely remembered hearing. And education? That was for another class, for another time. The village priest might teach a handful of boys to read if he'd survived the war himself. But most learned their letters by scratching them in dirt with sticks. Books were rare, expensive, dangerous to own in some places, and many had been lost, burned in abbeys, ruined and looted. Libraries soaked with blood. So the war created not just a generation of orphans and bastards, but a generation of ghosts. Children without records, without lands, without futures. Just warm bodies in a cold landscape, expected to pick up the pieces of a shattered world, with broken hands. And when they grew up, those hands would either rebuild or destroy again. Because when a generation is raised in ruins, their loyalty isn't to peace, it's to survival. And while kings sat on thrones of paper treaties, these children grew into adults with empty bellies and iron memories. But there was one institution that could have helped them. One place that claimed to be eternal, compassionate, and moral. The church. Except it was too busy counting coins. In theory, the church was supposed to be a refuge during the storm, a moral compass, a sanctuary, a shield for the weak. But during the 100 Years' War, it became something else entirely. A business, a fortress, a tax collector with a cross. If you were a peasant in the 14th or 15th century, the local priest wasn't just your spiritual guide. He was your landlord, your census taker, and sometimes your judge. And the church wasn't just part of society, it was society. It owned land, collected tithes, and wielded influence that rivaled kings. And while you bled and begged, the church built cathedrals, cloisters, treasure vaults. They called it divine duty. You called it robbery. Every year, you were expected to give a tithe 10% of everything you produced. 10% of your grain, 10% of your eggs, 10% of your animals, if you had them. And even if the war had scorched your fields and thieves had taken the rest, the priest still came knocking. And he wasn't always gentle. Refuse to pay? You might be excommunicated, denied burial in holy ground, cursed from the pulpit in front of your neighbors. Your suffering was reframed as your fault, a punishment for sin, not the result of war or politics. Meanwhile, church officials lived comfortably. Bishops dined like nobles. Some abbots had more wealth than the lords whose lands they sat on. In places like Avignon, where the papacy had temporarily relocated, the church looked more like a royal court than a house of God. And the hypocrisy? It stung. They preached humility while wearing gold rings. They talked of eternal salvation while bartering indulgences, pay forgiveness tokens to the highest bidder. You could buy your way out of purgatory, they said. Conveniently, right when the church needed to raise funds for a new wing of the cathedral. And when plague hit, many priests fled. They abandoned their parishes, ran from the dying, and locked the doors of their sanctuaries. Others profited, offering mass burials for obscene prices, or demanding donations for plague protection. Prayers, Some were genuinely holy, compassionate, brave, but they were drowned out by the machinery of greed and fear. And worst of all, the church justified the war. Both England and France claimed divine blessing. Both used sermons and scripture to convince peasants that their suffering was righteous. That dying in mud with a pike in your hand was part of God's plan. That your king was chosen, that the enemy was heretical, and that your reward was not peace on earth, but rest in heaven, if you were lucky. So even when you questioned the war, even when it bled your village dry, you were told to bow your head and obey. Because rebellion wasn't just treason, it was sin. And yet, under the surface, the cracks were forming. People began whispering, asking why God's house had so many silver goblets while children starved. Why salvation had a price. Why those who claimed to walk in Christ's footsteps wore silk and rode horses with golden bridles. Some began turning away, quietly, carefully. Others began writing dangerous words. Words that would one day explode into revolution. But first, the war would do something else. Something quieter, but just as cruel. It would erase the memory of what came before. For every life the war destroyed, there was a second death, a quieter one, the death of memory. Because while soldiers torched villages and ransacked towns, they also burned something irreplaceable, books. It didn't always make the headlines. It wasn't sung about in taverns. But it happened again and again. Abbeys looted. Monasteries set ablaze. Scriptoriums, those quiet chambers where monks spent decades copying texts by hand, reduced to piles of ash. Imagine it. A single book in the 14th century could take a lifetime to create. One monk might spend years transcribing it. Another might illuminate the pages with gold leaf and rich pigments. The parchment, painstakingly scraped and treated. The binding sewn by hand. That book could be the only one of its kind in existence. And then one careless soldier, looking for food, or coin, kicks over a candle, or tosses a torch for fun, or uses the parchment as kindling. Gone forever. It wasn't always intentional. Soldiers didn't march into towns thinking, let's destroy centuries of accumulated wisdom. But they didn't care either. When you're freezing, hungry, and angry, a book is just something to burn or sleep on. And so libraries vanished. Books on medicine, astronomy, law, farming techniques, local histories, religious commentaries, genealogies, myths, poems, all turned to smoke. Some of the worst damage came not in battle, but in the chaos after. When mercenaries drifted through the countryside, they often raided churches and monasteries looking for gold. If the monks resisted, the whole place burned. If they fled, the doors were smashed, and everything of value was looted, including sacred texts, which were often shredded, sold for binding scraps, or used to wrap stolen goods. In cities, the story wasn't much better. Town archives were sacked, court records lost, land titles destroyed. Whole families were erased from history, not by sword, but by fire. And the people, they noticed. You might have once known the name of your great-grandfather, the borders of your village, the date your chapel was consecrated. After the war, all of that was gone. Dates blurred, stories faded. Oral memory filled the gaps with ghosts. And while some texts survived hidden in caves, buried beneath ruins, carried off by fleeing monks, many didn't. Europe entered the war with fragile threads of knowledge stretched across time. It emerged with frayed edges. And yet, no one mourned the books. Not really. There were too many bodies to bury, too many mouths to feed. Grief had a waiting list. And history? That could wait. But in those ashes were things we'll never know. Lost remedies, forgotten languages, alternate versions of events. All of it gone, as surely as the names of the dead. And as knowledge burned, so did trust. People turned inward, suspicious, superstitious. If the books couldn't save them, maybe something else could. Something darker. By the end of the war, you were probably eating weeds. Not as a seasoning, as a meal. Because when the 100 Years' War finally wound down, the fields weren't ready to celebrate. They were ruined, scorched by raids, stripped by passing armies, and left to rot without farmers to tend them. The land had been at war just as much as the people. And the result was a famine that never really ended. Imagine waking up to a spring with no seed to sow. The grain had been stolen by soldiers last fall, or burned when the barn was torched, or eaten by desperate neighbors who begged you for help, then came back with knives when you said no. The soil is there, the rain is good, but you have nothing left to plant. And if you did, there are no oxen to pull the plow. They were taken years ago. No tools, either those, were melted down or sold off to pay taxes that never did any good. So you scratch the earth with your hands, pray, hope something grows, but hope doesn't fill bellies. You eat nettles boiled in dirty water, tree bark, shaved into soup, rats if you're lucky. And when winter comes again, the weak don't make it. The old, the sick, the infants. They simply stop moving. You bury them shallow, because the ground is frozen. And still, the lords collect, because hunger doesn't cancel taxes. If you don't have grain, they'll take your blankets, your roof tiles, your children, if they need bodies for labor. Bread becomes currency. A single loaf could cost as much as a day's wages if you have a coin. Most don't, so you barter. You steal. You give up dignity to buy one more week of life. And forget meat. That's a distant memory. Chickens are too valuable to eat. Pigs too rare to raise. You trap birds if you can. You trade favors for scraps. And in all this, the war drums are gone. The banners lowered. But still, you starve. Why? Because rebuilding takes more than peace. It takes infrastructure, tools, livestock, time, and none of that survived the war. Fields take years to become fertile again. Orchards take decades. And labor? That's gone too, dead in the soil, or moved to the cities in search of work that doesn't exist. In some towns, famine became ritual, a seasonal guest. Every year, it visited with the harvest and stayed until spring. People accepted. It learned to live smaller, weaker, hungrier. And what the famine didn't kill, disease did. Malnutrition invited every sickness. Children with distended bellies. Elderly whose bones snapped from standing too fast. Mothers who gave birth in barns and never stood again. But famine didn't just kill. It changed people. Neighbors turned cold. Kindness became dangerous. If you gave too much, you had nothing left. If you said no, you risked revenge. Eyes grew. Narrow, doors stayed shut. And into that vacuum of trust came whispers. That someone was to blame. That something was poisoning the crops. That dark forces were behind the rot. Because when food disappears, faith often goes with it. And that's when the real madness begins. When the fields don't grow, when your children die, and the church offers only silence or sermons, your mind starts to look elsewhere, somewhere darker, somewhere ancient. That's how it begins. The return of magic, not the whimsical kind, but the desperate kind, the dangerous kind. Because when the 100 Years' War left the countryside broken and starving, people didn't just lose faith in kings. They began to lose faith in reality. And in its place came fear. Fear of witches, of sorcery, of curses, of hidden hands poisoning wells and spoiling grain. If your cow died suddenly, witchcraft. If your baby was born deformed, the devil's. Work. If your neighbor had one too many chickens in a bad year, probably a pact with something infernal. The war had frayed everything logic, law, even memory. And into that crack, superstition crawled like a weed. It wasn't just whispered anymore. It became official. Authorities, desperate to explain ongoing misery, started to lean into the paranoia. Trials, accusations, confessions extracted through. Torture. Women, especially older women, widows, healers, and midwives, were often the first targets. Anyone who lived alone, or who knew too much about herbs, or who had a strange birthmark, could find themselves tied to a chair under suspicion. And it didn't stop there. People were drowned to prove they were witches, burned alive to cleanse the village, stoned or banished or branded for speaking against the church's version of events. Whole families destroyed because of a rumor, a dream, or a failed crop. This wasn't just a rural panic. It infected towns, courts, even monarchs. Kings began hiring astrologers. Nobles consulted alchemists. Some wore charms or prayed to saints with new fervor, terrified that invisible forces were plotting their downfall. One French noble reportedly refused to eat anything not prepared in front of him, convinced a sorcerer was trying to end his line. And all the while, real problems like hunger, sickness, and lawlessness went unanswered, because it was easier to blame the sky than fix the earth. But not everyone went bad. Some people saw opportunity. Charlatans traveled from village to village, offering potions and blessings for a price. Witch-finders offered their services to terrified towns. People sold fake relics, holy water, magic talismans, and prayers, guaranteed to keep raiders away. It was a booming market built on fear and ash. And while all this played out, children grew up watching it, seeing neighbors turned into monsters, seeing injustice paraded as salvation, seeing lies replace law. That changes a person. By the time those children became adults, they weren't looking for magic. They were becoming merciless. Because when belief fails and superstition turns violent, something else emerges in its place. People who only trust in the blade. And those people, they became the next generation of killers. Not for kings, but for coin. By the time the dust finally settled, something new had crawled out of the wreckage of the 100 Years' War. The professional killer. Not a knight. Not a soldier sworn to a lord. This was something colder, sharper, someone who didn't care. Who ruled, or why only that the coin was good and the job was clear. They weren't fighting for flags anymore. They were fighting for contracts. Because when war lasts for a century, people adapt. A boy who grows up learning to hold a sword instead of a spade doesn't just return to farming when the battles end, especially when there's nothing left to return to. So he does what he knows. He fights. And people like him didn't disappear. They became mercenaries. And not just ragged men with pointy sticks. These were organized, experienced, and terrifyingly efficient. Former captains of noble armies. Archers who had loosed volleys at Agincourt. Sappers who knew how to bring down a stone wall blindfolded. They formed companies, gave themselves names, hired themselves out to the highest bidder. 1 year they fought for France, the next for England. The year after that, for a minor duke who wanted to settle a land dispute. They lived in camps outside cities, drank in back alley taverns, trained in the old style, passed down from commanders who hadn't made it home. And when there was no war, they created one. Some were infamous. There was the White Company, full of English veterans who carved a path across Italy after the war, ended fighting for city-states like Florence and Milan. Their banner changed with the season. Their loyalty shifted with the wind. And then there were the Free Company's bands of ex-soldiers who weren't even pretending to serve anyone. They looted, raided, extorted. If they couldn't find a job, they made one. Siege a castle. Demand a ransom. Leave nothing but ashes behind. Governments hated them, but also needed them. Because as new conflicts brewed, as border disputes flared, as civil wars flickered into being, kings reached out to the very men who had once terrified them. Because these men got things done. They didn't need parades. They didn't need titles. Just pay, and maybe a pardon if things went south. And the people? They didn't know what to call them. They weren't knights. They weren't bandits. They weren't soldiers. They were something in between a new class of warrior shaped entirely by a century of violence. They had no home, no banner, no dreams of peace, only targets. They were the natural evolution of a war that never truly ended. A human symptom of institutionalized bloodshed. And they spread not just in France and England, but across all of Europe. Because the 100 Years' War had created more than orphans and widows. It had created a new economy, one built on blades. And if you wanted to survive in this world, you either hid from these men or became one. But what about the ones who couldn't fight anymore? The ones who came home broken? Their story was quieter, but no less brutal. The PTSD nobody named. They didn't have a word for it. There was no diagnosis, no term. No one talked about it. But it was there, etched into faces, hunched into shoulders, curled into the corner of silent rooms. The aftermath. You come home from the war. You've survived, but something's wrong. You can't sleep. Or when you do, you wake up gasping. You flinch at sudden sounds. Avoid crowds. Forget things. Or remember everything too vividly. The screaming. The mud. The eyes of the man you ran through with the sword. But nobody understands. There's no sympathy for your invisible wounds. You're a man. You came back alive. That should be enough. So you don't speak. You drink. You lash out. You withdraw. You watch your family tiptoe around you, afraid of whatever it is you've become. You don't know how to hold a plow anymore, but you can disembowel someone with a rusted dagger. What use is that in peacetime? Not much. Some men wander. Others disappear. Some are found swinging from rafters in barns or drowned in streams. But no one calls it what it is. They call it madness, weakness, or they don't call it anything at all. And the war machine keeps rolling, even after the treaties are signed. You weren't a knight. You weren't even a hero. You were one of the thousands, tens of thousands, who did what you were told and came back a stranger to your own village, to your own wife, to your own body. Some tried to rebuild, start families, push it all down. Others couldn't. They sat in taverns, talking to themselves, slept outside city walls, avoided church because even the sound of bells reminded them of alarms from sieges. People learned to look away, the same way they learned to look away from beggars or famine victims. These men were walking reminders that the war had cost something, and nobody liked being reminded of that. Even kings ignored them. No pensions, no healing, no programs. If you couldn't work or pay tax, you became a liability. Some made a name for themselves in pit fights. Some were hired muscle for merchants and nobles. Others became mercenaries again, hoping a blade would help them forget. It never did. And yet, in some way, their silence built the future. Because trauma isn't just passed through wounds, it's passed through generations. Children of these men grew up absorbing their father's vacant stares, sudden rages, sleepless nights. They inherited the weight, even if they never lifted a sword. And no one ever talked about it, because men weren't supposed to break. But they did, quietly, over years, behind closed doors. And the society around them kept praising honor, glory, chivalry. The story of the war was already being rewritten into legend. And those legends? They weren't for the broken. They were for the poets. The troubadours sang of knights and banners, of noble causes and heroic charges. The poets wrote verses about honor, about God's will, about righteous kings and fated battles. But you remember mud in your teeth and a man dying with his guts in his hands. The stories didn't match the scars. The 100 Years' War was already being retold before the blood dried. Chronicles written by men who'd never seen a battlefield. Tales of Agincourt as a divine miracle, of the Black Prince as a flawless warrior, of Joan as either a saint or a sorceress, depending on who was funding the book. People needed meaning. They needed to believe the horror had purpose, that all the starvation, the rape, the burned villages, it wasn't for nothing. So they swallowed the myth. But if you'd been there, if you'd fought or fled or buried your family under a stolen altar, you knew better. You knew war wasn't a chessboard. It was a pit. You remembered the French noble who trampled his own men trying to escape. The English archer who looted corpses and left them naked in the rain. The priest who turned a blind eye when his own side butchered refugees at the monastery gates. None of that made it into the ballads, and yet the myth grew. The 100 Years' War became romanticized in England as a time of strength, a glorious age. Proof that England could stand alone. Proof that God had smiled on longbows and muddy fields. In France, the myth was different, but no less distorted. Joan of Arc became a national icon. The reclaiming of land became a divine act. The suffering of the peasants, the infighting of the nobles all swept under a banner of unity. That never truly existed. History was being cleaned up, made presentable, turned into something you could teach in church or recite at a feast. But every time you passed a burned-out village, you remembered the smell. Every time you heard a church bell, you flinched. You couldn't unsee it, you couldn't pretend, and you weren't alone, because across France and England, there were thousands like you silent witnesses, survivors of a story that didn't want to include them. And yet, the myth had power. It reshaped how future wars were justified. It gave kings ammunition for new conquests. It made the next generation think that dying for land was noble, that bleeding for someone else's crown was glorious. The storytellers handed your pain to history, then painted over it. But truth has a way of leaking out. In quiet conversations, in half-remembered screams, in the eyes of a man who clutches his chest every time he hears a horse's whinny. And eventually the cracks show, because when the glory fades, all that's left is the cost. And the map of Europe? It would bear the war's fingerprints forever. When the last arrows fell and the cannons cooled, the 100 Years' War left more than rubble behind. It redrew the soul of a continent. Borders changed. Loyalties shifted. And ideas, quiet ones, slow ones, began to take root. First, the obvious. France had been nearly carved to pieces, but by the end, it came out more centralized than ever. The monarchy, once a patchwork of fragile allegiances, had finally stamped its authority across the land. The king was no longer just first among nobles. He was the state, a template for absolute rule. England, meanwhile, looked inward. The dream of a continental empire died at the gates of Normandy. No more French possessions, save for Calais, and even that would slip away soon after. English kings turned their attention to domestic squabbles, laying the groundwork for the Wars of the Roses. Power shifted. Parliament began to flex its muscles more often. The seeds of a different kind of governance were being sown. But the deeper changes weren't in palaces or parliaments. They were in the minds of the people. For centuries, war had been the business of nobles. A stage for knights to posture and bleed. But the 100 Years' War proved that wasn't enough. It took armies of commoners to win battles. Archers, infantry, men with no land, no title, no coat of arms. They became indispensable, and with that necessity came leverage. A peasant who'd marched to Poitiers and back wasn't the same man who once tugged his forelock and muttered, "Milord." He knew how to fight. He knew what he was worth. And sometimes, rarely, he began to ask why he had no say in the kingdom. He helped defend. It would take centuries for real change. But the cracks had formed. Feudalism, the old system of oaths and obligations, was dying. The Black Death had already weakened it. The war finished the job. Serfs began to vanish, not in death, but in law. Freedmen took their place. Markets rose where manors once ruled. Cities grew. Trade blossomed. The rise of national identity began to stir. People didn't just live on land anymore. They lived in countries. In France. In England. Not in Gascony or Kent. And warfare changed too. The longbow proved that a farmer with calloused hands could take down a knight. Gunpowder followed. Armor became useless. Castles, once the backbone of defense, fell to siege cannons. And explosives. The world of mounted lords ruling from stone towers was over. From now on, war would be about money, organization, technology. About nations, not noble families. And religion? The church had survived, but not untarnished. Its role in justifying endless slaughter, its greed, its silence during the worst atrocities, all of it planted quiet doubt in the minds of millions. That doubt would smolder until it burst into flames a century later during the Reformation. So yes, the 100 Years' War ended, but its fingerprints were everywhere. In the stronger monarchies, in the hollowed countryside, in the growing towns, in the lost trust, in the reshaped borders, in the way Europe thought about kings, God, law, violence, and itself. The war had broken the medieval world, and what rose from its ashes was something new, something still forming. But while scholars debated maps and monarchs, the ordinary people, they were still burying the dead, still counting losses, still walking through a world that looked the same, but would never be again. By the war's end, France and England weren't countries anymore. They were cemeteries. Everywhere you turned, there were reminders of what had been lost. Fields now held bones instead of barley. Trees grew over old trenches. Stone crosses marked where entire villages had once stood, and no one remembered their names anymore. And then there were the women, the widows. So many that in some towns, they outnumbered the living men 3 to 1. And they weren't just old women, shrouded. In black, they were young. Some had never even shared a bed with their husbands before they went off to fight. Others watched them leave with the promise of silver and glory, only to receive a helmet and a silence that never ended. They ran the farms, held the communities together, raised children alone. Some remarried, but many didn't. Who was left? The old? The broken? The killers with quiet eyes? And what about those children? They didn't play in fields or chase goats through pastures. They stood at the edge of graves. They learned to count by keeping track of lost relatives. Their lullabies were stories of siege and fire. Their heroes were ghosts. The war had created a generation that didn't just remember suffering, it normalized it. Starvation wasn't an emergency. It was seasonal. Burned villages weren't shocking. They were expected. Death wasn't distant. It was a neighbor. And grief? Grief became daily. You could see it in the architecture stone homes with no decoration, rebuilt quickly after the last raid. You could see it in the art images of skeletons dancing, of angels carrying severed heads. The danse macabre, a reminder that death came for everyone, regardless of age, class, or innocence. And while kings feasted and scribes penned treaties, the people kept burying their own. In shallow graves, in ruined churches, in fields that once grew wheat, and over time, even the names faded. The war had taken them. The silence after the war erased them. But the people who walked among those graves didn't forget. They carried the memory in their gait, in the way they avoided. Eye contact, and the prayers they whispered not to saints, but to the dirt. This was peace now. A haunted peace, built on ash. And just when it looked like life might start again, the drums began to rumble again. Not from war this time, but from plague. You thought it was over. The banners had fallen. The treaties signed. The kings stopped shouting. The mercenaries drifted off, and the last arrow had long since vanished into the mud. But the world didn't go quiet, because even without war, the rhythm of fear kept pounding, like distant drums that never really stopped, just slowed, changed tempo, and waited for the next excuse to pick up again. You still flinched at thunder, still watched the road at sunset, still kept food buried beneath floorboards, because peace didn't bring safety. It brought uncertainty. And then came the returning plagues. It wasn't just one wave of the Black Death. It came back in cycles. Again in the 1360s. Again in the 1370s. And after the war, still again. You never knew when it would strike, but when it did, it came with the same horrors, black boils, fevered moans, the sharp snap of carts, creaking under the weight of bodies. Towns already reduced by war now lost their last healers. The few elderly, who remembered how to help others, were the first to die. Priests stumbled through empty churches, and the people who had just started to build again, to trust again, saw their neighbors collapse all over again. And yet, the world kept going, not because it got better, but because people had learned to walk forward, even while everything burned behind them. The 100 Years' War had taught Europe one thing above all. Survival isn't triumph, it's habit. You survive by stepping over corpses, by rebuilding the wall with the same stones that killed your brother, by marrying again, even though your first husband's body was never found, by planting seed in soil that once drank blood. And in this so-called peace, the social order hardened. Those who'd profited from the war held on to their wealth. New laws were passed to keep peasants from leaving their lords. Labor was still scarce, and the nobility wasn't going to risk losing control now. But the people were different. They remembered the lies, the promised glory, the kings who hid, the priests who stayed silent, the lords who galloped away just before the fire started. They remembered Joan of Arc, the Jacquerie, the famines, the screams that never made it into any chronicle. And they passed those memories down, not in books, but in songs, in warnings, and lullabies that sounded more like curses. 100 years of war had taught them that peace wasn't a gift from above. It was a pause, a thin breath before the next storm. And Europe, scarred, shaken, but still standing, would carry that lesson forward. Because soon, there would be new wars, new kings, new famines, but always the same people caught in the middle, pressed between crown and coffin. Because history doesn't forget how to make corpses. It just learns new rhythms to march to. Not everyone got a grave. The big battles, Poitiers, Agincourt, Crécy, those left behind neat rows of the fallen, sometimes buried by the victors, sometimes dragged into mass pits by scavengers. But the true death toll of the 100 years. War was scattered across forests, hills, and empty stretches of farmland where no one ever wrote anything down. Because most people didn't die in battles. They died on roads, in fields, in burned-out barns, in ditches beside rivers swollen with spring rain and corpses. And no one came to find them. There were no funeral processions, no bells, just silence and wind and time. A soldier caught in an ambush might crawl for miles before dying alone beneath a tree. A farmer hiding food from passing troops might be struck down and left in his garden to rot. A fleeing family, overtaken by plague or soldiers or both, might never even be missed. Animals ate what they found. Trees grew over the bones. Eventually, new paths were built through the same woods. Children played among wildflowers that grew over what was once blood-soaked ground, and they never knew. These were the forgotten dead, the ones who didn't make it into any king's tally or bishop's eulogy. No record, no relic, just bones slowly fading into the soil. Sometimes someone found them years later, a skull poking through the dirt, a rib cage entangled in roots. But even then, no one knew who they were. They weren't saints or heroes, just people. Ordinary people caught in extraordinary misery, and the countryside kept absorbing them. Over time, stories would grow around those places. That grove is haunted. Don't walk near that hill at night. That stream runs red in spring. Superstition took over where memory failed. But the truth was simpler. The land hadn't forgotten. It was just heavy with names no one had ever spoken. And the worst part? There were so many. Because while cities could count their dead, the rural world had no ledgers, no registers. Just families that vanished, villages that disappeared, entire communities swallowed by time. And when the church tried to move on, when the kings redrew borders, those bodies stayed. 1,000 unmarked memorials beneath the very fields people farmed again in the years that followed. Which raises the question, if no one remembers you, did you ever really live? And if that's how the war ended for so many, what hope was left for those trying to live in what came after? You'd think one round of the Black Death was enough. That after killing nearly half of Europe in just a few short years, it would be done. Exhausted, finished. But no, it came back, and then it came back again. The 100 Years' War might have been intermittent, but the plague was loyal. It returned in waves every decade or two, without fail. A cruel metronome ticking through the wreckage of war, snatching what survivors remained, and making sure the rebuilding never got too comfortable. Imagine this. You've finally managed to harvest a decent crop. You've patched the roof. Your child made it to 5 years old, and for once, you believe they might make it to 6. Then, someone in the next village, it's a fever, and you know what's coming. First, it's one family, then 2, then 10. The air gets quiet. Carts vanish from the roads. Bells start ringing again. You boil water, cover your mouth, avoid gatherings. Doesn't matter. The symptoms always find a way in. Boils in the armpits, vomiting black, then silence. Within days, the fields are empty again. And here's the worst part. This version of the plague wasn't always the same. Sometimes it was bubonic swelling lymph nodes, festering sores. Other times it was pneumonic spreading through coughs, almost always fatal. Or septicemic so fast, you died before you even knew what hit you. And every time it came back, it found a population already weakened by hunger, by grief, by poverty. People who barely had the strength to dig graves anymore. Sometimes the corpses piled up faster than they could be buried. Again, just like before, the church lost even more credibility. Priests died alongside their flocks. Doctors ran, and no one could explain why God kept doing this. Some blamed sign, some blamed the alignment of planets. Some blamed foreigners, fueling more violence, more purges, more fear. But deep down, everyone knew the truth. No one was safe. Not the king in his fortress, not the monk in his cloister, not the child born in a barn, coughing before she could speak. The war had taught people how to survive swords and arrows. But the plague, that was different. You couldn't fight it. You couldn't run. It moved faster than any army. And so it shaped life in invisible ways. Weddings became smaller. People stopped traveling. Markets thinned. Schools emptied. Whole towns became time capsules frozen by fear, untouched for years. And each time the plague retreated, it left behind fewer people, less hope, more walls, more suspicion, more superstition. Because what kind of world kills off half of your family in one war? And the other half with an invisible hand? And yet people still tried to live, which meant finding ways to survive that weren't taught in sermons or songbooks. Some of them turned to trade. Others turned to something darker. When law breaks down, new rules rise up. After a century of war, plague, and famine, entire economies collapsed, and new ones grew like weeds through the cracks. If the crown couldn't feed you and the church couldn't protect you, you turned to the one system that did seem to work, the black market. And in the shadows of ruined cities and looted castles, war itself became a business, not just for kings, but for everyone. Looting was the most obvious trade. After battles, survivors didn't grieve. They scoured the dead. Rings, belts, boots, teeth, even arrowheads were salvaged. A field littered with corpses was just a marketplace with better margins. Some looters weren't even soldiers, just locals with strong stomachs and empty pockets. They'd creep onto the field after. The smoke cleared, dragging bodies into ditches and rifling through what the victors had missed. And if you were caught looting the wrong body, a noble, a banner bearer, you could end up hanging beside the corpse you stripped. Then there was grave robbing. Mass burials meant shallow graves, easy access. Plague pits became treasure hunts. It wasn't about gold, though. It was sometimes there. It was about fabric, tools, metal buckles, anything remotely valuable. Weapons found their way into peasant hands, traded for chickens or favors. Armor was repurposed, melted down, or patched together into mismatched suits sold on the road. Entire businesses were built from battlefield scraps. Even religious relics weren't safe. Monasteries were raided not just for their gold, but for saintly bones, sacred cloth, fragments of crosses. A blackened rib claimed to be from a martyr could fetch a high price, especially from frightened nobles hoping for protection in a world gone mad. And as war continued, smuggling flourished. Salt, grain, cloth, horses, all moved in secret to avoid wartime tariffs and levies. Some border towns lived entirely on contraband. Nobles looked the other way, or even took a cut. Then came the fakers. Impostors posing as wounded knights to collect charity. Forgers who created fake tax exemptions or proof of ransom letters. Merchants selling sawdust as flour. Traveling surgeons who carried more lies than medicine. And everyone played along. Because what else could you do? You couldn't trust the crown. The taxman bled you dry. The church charged you for blessings. But the guy selling black powder behind the tavern? He gave you a fair price. No questions asked. It was a twisted kind of honesty. And it wasn't just for criminals. Mothers traded stolen boots to clothe their sons. Farmers sold looted arrowheads to buy bread. Widows pawned off helmets just to bury their dead. Survival blurred the lines. And in the chaos, a new economy took root. One born in fire and blood. It wasn't noble. It wasn't legal. But it worked. And for the next generation, the children raised by these rules, it became normal. Because when you grow up watching lies, get rewarded and law get ignored, you don't become a farmer. You become something harder. They were born in ruins, raised in silence, fed on scraps and stories of fire. The children who survived the Hundred Years' War weren't just casualties of history. They were the foundation of what came next. And for many of them, the only future they could see was the same one their fathers died in: war. Because if you were a child in the aftermath, peace wasn't soft. It didn't come with full tables or warm beds. It came with empty fields, hollowed villages, and elders too, broken to teach you anything except how not to die. You learned quickly how to gut a fish, how to spot a soldier before he saw you, how to run fast when the tax collector came, how to swing a stick like a blade, and how to keep your mouth shut when strangers passed through. There were no schools, no apprenticeships, just hunger and the memory of screams. And if you were a boy, you were expected to fight, not as a knight that world was fading, but as fodder. Infantry, mercenary, spearman. If you could hold a pike and stand in formation, you had value. Lords always needed muscle. City-states always needed guards. The next war was always around the corner. Some were recruited young, taken at 13, blooded by 14, dead or maimed by 15. Others joined bands of mercenaries, eager for food and coin. The ones who lived longer learned to be cruel, or they didn't live long at all. If you were a girl, the path was no kinder. You were married off early, often to old men too scarred or drunk to care about your name. Or worse, you were left to fend for yourself, to barter safety with silence and obedience. A few disguised themselves as boys and joined the companies. Others became couriers, spies, smugglers. All of them learned that innocence had no currency, and the cycle continued, because these children raised in violence carried it forward, into the civil wars that followed, into the local feuds that flared up where royal armies once stood, into petty acts of revenge passed down like heirlooms. They didn't grow up dreaming of peace. They grew up expecting betrayal. Trust no one. Hide what you own. Carry a knife. By the late 1400s, Europe had a new generation one that had never known stability, only the rhythm of marching boots and morning bells. And while the kings began talking about Renaissance and reform, these children were still watching shadows for danger. The 100 Years' War hadn't just stolen their parents. It had stolen their childhood. And without that foundation, what grew in its place was hard, bitter, and hollow-eyed. A generation of survivors. A generation of soldiers. A generation already bracing for the next disaster. Because even if no one declared a new war, they could still hear it. In the silence. In the walls. In their own blood. There were no fireworks, no cheers, no cities erupting in celebration. When peace finally came, it didn't walk into the village in shining armor. It slouched in, quiet and cold, dragging behind it the bones of 100 years. What did it look like? It looked like a field half sown, because there weren't enough men to finish the work. It looked like a child crying in a barn, calling for a mother who never came back from the plague. It looked like silence. No drums, no horns, no riders on the hill. Just the hum of flies over old graves and the wind curling through broken roofs. Peace didn't mean safety. It meant absence. No more armies marching through. No more screams in the night. Just the echo of everything that had been lost. You didn't feel relief. You felt confusion. What now? You'd been fighting, hiding, running for so long that normal life felt unfamiliar, suspicious. You didn't trust it. You kept a dagger under your bed. You still slept with one ear open. You still jumped at the sound of hooves. And when people came asking for taxes, to rebuild, you laughed. Because rebuild what? The village burned down 3 times. The church was looted and re-looted. The priest drinks himself to sleep and mutters about demons. There's no healer, no carpenter, no real roof over your head. And yet, you lived. You planted. Slowly, you patched walls with scrap wood. You tied together new families from the remnants of old ones. You named your child after a brother you'd buried in a plague pit. You walked past the skeleton of a barn that once held your wedding feast and didn't cry anymore. That was peace, not joy, not restoration, just the absence of fresh violence. And that was enough. For now, because in your bones you still carried the rhythm of marching, the scream of steel, the smell of smoke and wet soil. You knew that peace was a season, just like war, and seasons always change. But for this moment, there was stillness. And in that stillness, something strange. Not happiness, not hope, just the faint, unfamiliar sense that maybe, just maybe, you didn't have to run today. And in a world built on blood and ash, that feeling, that was the closest thing to peace you'd ever know.